Welcome, everybody, to Great Novels of the 22nd Century. We have a guest tonight, Jordan S. Carroll, whose study on the alt-right and science fiction speculative whiteness won the Hugo Award. It is a biting little book that raised my eyebrows considerably and caused me to rethink an awful lot of my assumptions about this field that I love. So, without further ado, welcome, Mr. Carroll. And let me ask right off the bat, what drew you to this topic? And then we'll go from there.
Well, yeah, thank you all for having me. I think it was, a number of things. I've been a lifelong fan of science fiction, fantasy, and genre fiction more broadly. I think the initial germ of the project came when I started reading the blogs of Nick Land, who is this British academic who, was very much into cyberpunk and Lovecraft, and a lot of the things that I was interested in. And yet he had, at least according to some reports, some kind of break, and then turned towards the far right. So initially, there was some puzzlement about how could somebody who is a scholar and a science fiction fan, with much of the same sensibility that I had, becoming reactionary. But then history kind of progressed, and it became increasingly clear over the course of the 20 teens that this was a significant tendency within fan culture, and cyber culture. And so I started looking at first, I think Vox Day, I did a talk on him, and it kind of spiraled out from there. And I realized that this was something that is not just limited to a few odd fascist bloggers, but in fact was something that went back decades and decades and was rooted in science fiction culture and not just simply a kind of latter day appropriation of science fiction culture by a few opportunists.
Okay. So, how did you do the research? I mean, what, where would you go to find all this stuff from the 30s and extrapolate it forward? Because it seems like the genre sort of grew organically, especially with the publishing environment in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So, sorting through that must have been.
Yeah, I think that in some ways, the more recent years are better documented in the book. And in fact, I had a significant amount of trouble with some of the early figures in the book who aren't as well documented. Um, but I did, go back and look at, for example, the political party that I talk about with Madel at the beginning. I went back and looked at his notice, and things like that. But the main purpose, I think, of that chapter, was again to like dispel this idea that science fiction was pure and progressive. And then at some point, with the advent of the internet, things changed. And I was also just interested in looking at that sense of kind of fan exceptionalism, um, the fans or slans idea, and thinking about what that might mean, that kind of fan elitism in that period.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of turned my head a bit because, we kind of, some of us kind of smile at that sort of excess enthusiasm, I suppose you would call it, on the part of certain fans. But this put a slightly more sinister slant on the whole thing.
Yeah, in some ways, like, there's some aspects of it that I can sympathize with, like being a sort of put upon person who's bookish and feels alienated. There was a point in time, I feel like, when it certainly made sense to feel a sort of ironic kind of kinship and an ironic kind of I don't want to say chauvinism, but a sort of boosterism for fandom. Um, and but at the same time, though, I feel like we've gotten to a point where science fiction culture and more broadly speculative culture has become so dominant that I don't know the at a moment when most blockbuster films are have some science fiction in their DNA and the tech industry is run by science fiction or nerds. I feel like it might be time to put that behind us, even the more benign forms of it.
Yeah, we kind of won,
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right? Like,
but
you know,
it was really noticeable when when I was a teenager, back 50 years ago. Um, you were, I don't know, sneering is the right word, but sometimes it was sneering. There was this whole feeling, and I guess my reaction, and I think a very common reaction among most people I had contact with in the 70s, was to look back at the whole fans are slans thing, partly because my personal opinion, Van Vogt, not a very good writer, but uh, and just say, well, that was just really silly. At the same time, you recognize that, yeah, it was partly a reaction to, like you said, people putting you down all the time. Not a healthy reaction, but an understandable reaction, I suppose, what I'd say.
a very human reaction.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Well, people from time to time used to ask me, why do I like science fiction so much? And as a kid, I could honestly say that it was the kind of escapism where what was in your head mattered more than what you could do physically.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
That the bright kid in the plot was going to win the day rather than the athlete. Of course, gradually that they sort of combined and in some instances separated, and I think there was a whole subgenre of augmented humans that it became, especially in the movies, where the cyborg became more interesting than the technology itself, uh, which has a kind of Ubermensch
mhm,
quality to it if you look at it a certain way, which is a little bit distressing. Remember the first Worldcon that I went to was in Anaheim, and I walked into a party and there were a bunch of people huddled in a corner laughing at what they had done. They'd gone to Disneyland the day before and apparently had commandeered one of the rides on the little river there and were rushing at other boats. And it says, "Did you see the look on those mundanes' faces?" And I just thought, what's wrong with you? What mundanes? I had never heard any of this before. And I thought, oh, it's just okay. There's a bunch of these people in every group, and I just kind of set it aside. But the interesting thing that I think that came out of that is that there are some people who read science fiction. Everybody reads science fiction for a variety of reasons, but I'm simplifying for the purposes of this argument. We'll read it with an idea of working through the conditions for creating institutions that will make a better future. And then there are people who read it looking for the magic bullet that's going to make them rise up out of their situation, the kind of silver bullet that's going to get them to the next level. Sometimes you can find them both those things in the same work, quite often. Uh, but it seems to me that one can lead to a pathology, which I don't think you actually use that word in this whole book, but that seems to be where it's coming from. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a feeling on the part of some science fiction readers um, that they have this special potential, that there's something inside of them that's just waiting to get out, and that it's being overlooked. And under the right circumstances, they could become the mutant, the cyborg, the Ubermensch, and that this is a great injustice towards them. And then, yeah, as you point out, there are also people who are interested not in this idea of um, fantasies of rising up and dominating others, but instead a more egalitarian world where um, it's not about some inborn potential. It's about the idea that everybody could be fed and clothed and educated and then be able to live up to their dreams.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's kind of hard to find. But the writer Charles Gannon
Mm-mm.
published his master's thesis as one of his first publications, a book called Infernal Engines, and it's a history of the pre-H.G. Wells science fiction that was done in the second half of the 19th century, and almost all of it is we would define as military SF. It was essentially fiction written to exercise the ideas of what the next weapon systems were going to be. And apparently it was a huge industry for a while, which, I knew nothing about until I read that book. It's very well documented, but some of that must indeed have lingered on into the 20th century and informed quite a bit of what followed. H.G. Wells, of course, took it as a way of saying, war is a stupid thing. Let's not do this stuff. And you can see where he got some of his technological ideas from this precursor fiction. But this alternate SF apparently has been a thing for a long, long time.
Yeah, yeah, and we've seen kind of collisions or I guess a better word might be collaborations between science fiction thinking and the military industrial complex. The Star Wars program in the 80s, but more recently, we have a renaissance of defense tech, and people like Palmer Luckey are citing anime and science fiction as inspiration for new military technologies. And I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, a number of people have kind of looked at this. I mean, Colin Milburn, I think, has written about this. Science fiction is a great way to um, tout the potential benefits of new technologies and especially military technologies. It's way more appealing to investors, whether it be government or private investors, to show them here is what the automated drone is going to look like, or here's what this new weapon system is going to look like. And so it is a kind of science fiction, but it's also very much being influenced by more conventional literary or cinematic science fiction.
Hmm.
So I was the one who first suggested we read this book in the group. It came to my attention when it was already nominated for a Hugo, but hadn't yet won. And I voted for it, by the way, because I liked it very much. But I was in attendance at the Hugo Awards ceremony in Spokane when the sad puppies and rabid puppies got their first very sound beating from fandom. And I really like the way that you contextualize that event historically in a broader narrative about this thread in science fiction that goes way back. Um, I would say it's interesting that the alt-right just pretty much hates Star Trek, but they can embrace Star Wars. And if you look at that, I mean, you talked about Lieutenant Uhura and Lieutenant Sulu, and I guess later Commander Sulu, and Captain Sulu, and but you contrast that with like the first Star Wars movie in 1977, where it was an all-white cast except for a voice actor who was uncredited. And so you could see why they would embrace that, right? And it's all about, and Star Wars is more about the great man theory of history, and Star Trek, for all Captain Kirk's, cowboy diplomacy, is about um, solving problems, as a group, working together.
I'd like
Yeah.
to
Oh, go
add
ahead.
one thing into that. Great man doesn't work there because in Lucas's trilogy, everything happens because people work together. Luke cannot save the day on his own.
That's true.
He's a
But
limited special person.
so I'm gonna say that Luke and Han are great men, and they're honored in a literal fascist medal ceremony at the end of the movie that was, as Lucas said, inspired by Triumph des Villains by Leni Riefenstahl.
Right. And some thought that was a way for him to suggest that maybe the Force was a little more fascist than
Whether it
we were
was,
thinking.
fascist or secretly fascist, or anti-fascist, like, the movie version of Starship Troopers. is up for debate. But the imagery is absolutely
Yes.
came out of Leni Riefenstahl, right? And so I don't think that disproves great men if you allow for Luke and Han to both be great men in that reading. Anyway, but I'm curious about what Jordan thinks about that and the alt-right and how, because I like the way you talked about how they creatively misread and misinterpret and leave things out so they can spin Warhammer 40K as utopian rather than dystopian, and Dune as utopian rather than very clearly dystopian.
Or
Yeah,
the
no,
thing
okay.
what I saw today, it's a quote, I think it was from Peter Thiel, saying something about how Mordor was clearly the well-organized, technologically superior society, and the hobbits were a bunch of nuts that just wanted to putter around in their gardens.
Yeah, it is about industrialization, and that was one of Tolkien's points. But anyway,
Well, just I've got to say this. All I was thinking is, sorry for the diversion, but I'm going to forget later. During the whole time when you talk initially about deferred gratification and planning for the future, it doesn't match how any boardroom is run today when everything's on quarterly things. And in
Yeah.
terms of deferred gratification for pleasure, by that definition, Trump is not white.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that a lot of the alt-right's commentary on that is precisely misrecognizing social problems as biological or genetic problems. I think our society has become more short-termist because, yeah, it's organized around financial or speculative incentives, and now it's led by yeah, the capriciousness of somebody like Trump, who is mainly interested in less than a 24-hour news cycle at this point, rather than planning some sort of grand future. Yeah, so I think that they really have kind of misread the actual source of that problem. But yeah, I think to get back to the question of Star Trek versus Star Wars, I'm not going to maybe comment necessarily on the politics of Star Wars, but I think it is right that that axis of, is it about a collective struggle for what's better, or is it about a great hero, I think is really important. And indeed, I think often we see in ostensibly progressive science fiction texts, they take up these ideas of the person who is chosen or special or somehow spiritually or biologically unique, and they're going to change the world. I think that that is a trap that we have to avoid. And I think that science fiction that focuses instead on the great masses of people or the institutions often is more politically productive.
How do you think that idea of the chosen ones carries over to, I'll say the tech bros that are running Silicon Valley, and they have this, um, especially Elon Musk has this idea of the non-player characters. I mean, it seems like that's the same concept going on here with these billionaires, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, they see themselves as the protagonists of history, and they see everybody else as props, or yeah, as non-player characters in a giant video game that they're in the process of winning. So yeah, dividing everybody up into the people who are exceptional, and most importantly, for at least this conversation, the people who can make change and innovate, and the people who are stuck in the past or stuck in the present. I think that's the kind of fantasy that underpins so much of the right and is now a part of the ideology of tech bros.
So you talked and very sensibly about the Marching Morons, which is a story that I never much liked, but on a recent, well, recent as in 20 years ago, but on a rereading after I was much older than when I first read it, I was shocked at how really horrifying the whole thing was. And the notion of sending all the losers on a ship to Venus, it just struck me talking about Elon Musk and people like him. They want to go to Mars and colonize Mars. They may be unconsciously sending themselves on the same foolish trip that that the so-called heroes and emerging morons sent what they thought were the inferiors.
I think we can all agree that we support the idea of Elon Musk going to Mars.
Well, he's got to get his car back. I mean, still can't get into his garage. Uh, um, the other aspect of this that struck me, and I'm going to speak purely from a personal aspect. I grew up. I'm 71, so you can imagine what kind of social milieu I grew up in. It was almost all white. So when I discovered science fiction, and of course there were aliens and all that, and I read it, it never occurred to me to question the uh, the the genotype of the protagonists. But as I grew older and read more, it simply ceased to matter in my reading. And I've spoken to other people, women and minorities who liked science fiction for one reason among many, that they could read the book and regardless of the descriptions, particularly those novels that didn't have descriptions, they could imagine whatever racial type or gender type they wanted to, and it all worked fine. Um, but the whiteness of it is undeniable in a lot of ways because the cultural institutions that were often the underpinnings of a lot of the stories were very much mid 20th century America, white America. Um, and I kind of want to address even watching Star Trek when I was a kid, and of course Gene Roddenberry very intentionally decided to diversify the crews to make a point. Um, they were all very white in spite of their diversity. I mean, the behaviors, etc. You could say, well, yeah, that's 200 years, 300 years in the future. And of course, the culture has become, in certain ways homogenized. Uh, but how important a factor do you actually think that was over time in the construction of science fiction as a genre? How conscious was that on the part, or were they just simply going the easiest route in constructing their narratives?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I could see it both ways in some ways. Like on one hand, I I think we need science fiction narratives that are about the persistence of racism and other prejudices in the future, such that the identities of the characters really do matter in the story. Um, and I could also see the value of science fiction narratives where race and other kinds of identities cease to be operative in the future. At the same time, though, I think you're right that we also don't want to get into the problem of the kind of the white liberal subject becoming the default and everybody just sort of looking like that as or acting like that as well. So I feel like it's tricky because you want to imagine a diverse future. Um, but I think that not every single narrative should also be imagining that our present disorder is just going to continue forever.
Hmm.
I have a couple comments. I find myself reading science fiction, and there's two things going on in my head. It's a really fascinating sciency experience, right? Really cool things are happening. And then a stunning lack of creativity when it comes to culture or character relationships, going on at the same time. And I think I told you guys in the book club a while back that now when I read things, I start off and I assume everybody's female until there's something else that tells me different. I'm reading it as a she. And sometimes that really smacks me in the face. And your book, Jordan, I read the whole book and I was like, I really hope this is a woman that wrote this. I mean, not yay that you wrote it, but I read it through and I was like, I'm reading this with a woman's voice as the author. And it's kind of changed my viewpoint on a lot of things when I go in with that perspective.
I purely by accident several years ago. It did it to two authors in the same issue of a magazine I was reviewing, Vylar Kaftan and Lavi Tidar. The first story I read by either one of them. And I interpreted their names by what gender the first name seemed like. And Lavi seemed like a woman's name, and Vylar seemed like a man's name. And that influence in my head when the characters are introduced and you don't know necessarily what gender they are. Sometimes I default was probably the viewpoint character is probably the same gender as the author. And it was really interesting to realize I was dead wrong. I don't know if Lavi's ever commented on that. Vylar has said that she was thrilled to see that and she thought it was really cool because I misgendered them in the story itself until somebody, in the review itself until somebody alerted me. And my good friend Claire Cooney, we've had her on here before, publishes as CSE Cooney, so no implied gender. And her very first story that I saw, it may have been her first published story, was about a very overtly, aggressively male character. And I simply assumed that the C behind CSE Cooney was a man. And I met her maybe a year later. She's rather obviously not a man. and John O'Neill introduced me to John's a very good friend of both of ours, and he did it with malice aforethought to surprise me to learn Claire's actual. It is interesting when you think you come. Maybe not everyone does, but I do, unfortunately, perhaps. Knowledge of the author's gender or race or nationality can influence the way we approach their work. And sometimes that's productive, actually, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah, I'm now publishing fiction under J.S. Carroll, so I'm gonna avoid the possible assumptions with my name. But I guess my name could go either way.
Speaking of, we were talking about, you were talking, or maybe Mark, about was the rather white casts or assumed to be white casts of most science fiction through at least into the 60s. Was that consciously done or just a subconscious one? And I've generally thought it's mostly people not unthinkingly reflecting their own milieu. Even though there's this noticeable right-wing substrate to science fiction, the many or most of the leading writers tend to have, let's just say, mostly traditional liberal views and tend to try to promote the field as we are promoting a better, more egalitarian future, which is a good thing. But that doesn't mean that they still don't have varied assumptions that just influence what they write. But I just wanted to cite a really striking and shocking example, a Scottish writer named J.T. Mintosh, who was very popular through the 50s and into the 60s and then sort of faded from view entirely. He was a writer who could tell an engaging story in sometimes shockingly stupid ways. But one of his novels, and I was really just astonished to read this passage.
That's quite an endorsement there, Rich.
Well, he's a writer you can enjoy while you're reading him and then realize that, yes, this is really silly stuff, but which is not uncommon in all fields, but certainly in science fiction. But here's a novel in which everyone a small subset of humanity has to flee Earth because the world is falling apart. I mean, literally, I think, almost. And they're going to another planet. And it's just, I don't know, tens of thousands of people, but nothing near the entire population of the world. And there's a little passage, and it's going on. It's kind of a normal story. They're bravely trying to set up the new civilization on a new planet, whatever. And there's a little passage and said, the moral says, yeah, everyone here is white. And said, the whole world got together when we were sending out this spaceship and realized that we don't want to perpetuate racial divisions in the future, so we will only allow one race. I mean, it's just an astonishing. And then they're like, and of course, the Asian and Black people thought that's a very sensible idea. We'll go right along with us. And I thought, what in the world? I
Good
mean,
Lord.
it is an astonishingly blinkered and
Yeah,
very
yeah.
racist point of view.
Like
So it
the
could
ending
come
of
out in the open. Uh,
it's like the ending of the movie version of When Worlds Collide,
Oh
which
which
had
has
a
yeah.
got that
similar plot.
crew that is
Yeah.
100% white
I
Mhm.
was
that are going to
oh,
repopulate the new world.
as Rich was talking, I was actually thinking about the novels because there's a sequel. There's Afterworlds Collide,
Afterwards,
which is
yeah.
about the settling of Bella. I think it was Bella that they one of the two. And it turns out, in the novels, there's more than one ship. There's a fleet that actually goes, but there's also a Russian fleet,
Mhm.
and they land on the other side of the planet. And after worlds collide, it basically reignites the Red Scare. And
Mhm.
so there's this Cold War that starts, and of course the Americans on one side have to beat the Reds on the other side. It just completely subverts the communality of the effort to save humanity from the first book. It says, yeah, now we're here on a new world and we're going to do the same damn thing again. It's kind of astonishing in some ways, but then you realize those novels were published in the 30s, and the milieu in which against which they were written was that kind of us and them thing that was growing toward World War II. And it's amazing when writers break free of that. I kind of expect to find a lot of older fiction to reflect the prejudices of its day. And when I find a book that steps outside of it, I'm like, oh, this is one worth keeping. Um, and I also, since this whole thing with the sad puppies and all of this and the socially conscious approach to science fiction that's been going on for probably forever, but I became aware of it probably in the 80s in a big way. I'll occasionally reread something that one of my favorite things and find an aside. I was astonished to discover that Isaac Asimov had written Hober Mallow as a black man. There's one paragraph that describes him, and it's clear where he was going, and then he never brings it up again. So some of these guys were slipping this stuff in, like Heinlein did a couple of times. Um, and we'll just get this past everybody. It'll be there. Maybe it'll work on people over time. But
I did like that in the Foundation series, they did have
yeah,
gender race diversity in
yes,
there.
yeah. I mean, in the case
Not a
of
lot of heights, but yay.
yeah, the case of something like the Foundation trilogy, you are, as a reader, free to imagine any color palette you want, for the most part, which made it interesting to me that I found this one instance where he noted uh, Hober Mallow. You could say Hober Mallow's race, which umpteen tens of thousands of years in the future. What does that actually mean? Nevertheless, he took the time to put that in there for a present day audience, presumably for a reason. Um,
I wonder if he did that for the book version and had left and hadn't put that paragraph in the original magazine story. I have no idea, to be honest with you.
that's a good question. I have no idea
Or it
what
could have been taken out by the magazine editor, put back.
Well, one way or the other, yes.
Campbell. Yeah, of course he might have.
Yeah,
Or he
so
might.
let's talk a little bit about John W. Campbell because you mention him in the book, but you don't go into a great length about it. But it seems that like a lot of his rules absolutely follow into the alt-right. Like we can't have aliens that are better or more sophisticated than us, right? And of course the Campbellian science fiction is, super white. And even and actually many years ago there was a documentary on John W. Campbell where they have footage of him in the 1960s, and then they have a whole bunch of writers talking about him, and they're all praising him and how great an editor was. And then you get Michael Moorcock, and he's like, "Well, John Campbell was a fascist," and he starts with that, and I love Mike for that, but he was right, and
Well,
he
Campbell
felt
was not a fascist. He was a racist. He was a reactionary. He was not a fascist.
take it up with Mike. I'm
Well,
quoting
Mike's
Michael Moorcock.
full
I'm
of
not.
bombast, but no.
Um, but I will say that Campbell in print said that black people were happier under slavery, right? Like, I mean, he was that far gone. So I was wondering. I mean, you chose to write a monograph with your focus, but you touched on Campbell because, of course. But it wasn't a big theme in the book, and I'm wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about Campbell.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have too much to add to that. I think you're right about his racial prejudices and his I would add glorification of the kind of omnicompetent great man kind of story as well. Um, but I mean, thinking about the alien in Campbell kind of makes me think about if you all have seen recently um, the Trump administration's new website that depicts immigrants as invading aliens from another planet who
I
have
haven't seen that.
infiltrated our society, using the pronoun it to refer to them and talking about
Wow.
repatriating them to their proper planet. So I think that we can learn a lot about somebody's politics from the way that they construe aliens. Are aliens a threat? Are they, bug-eyed monsters who are going to eat us? Are they non-existent, or as in other, maybe, Star Trek, for example, are they potentially collaborators, partners, and equals?
Yeah, until I read your book, I never thought of the gray alien stereotype as coming out of anti-Semitic stereotypes. That was
Yeah.
a surprise to me.
Yeah, when I saw that as well, I was surprised because I always just imagined them as a sort of like sexless, fetal, kind of like
Mhm.
uncanny. But when I saw that, it made perfect sense. The kind of stereotype of the hyper intelligent puppet master who's manipulating, red-blooded rural Americans and violating them. Like,
Mhm.
it all kind of fits together in that mythology.
There's one Jewish writer, it might have been William Tenn, I can't remember who said he went in and talked to Campbell, and
It was
people
William
started,
Penn.
yeah, praising him for how he didn't use the word fiendishly, of course, but you could hear the subtext behind how intelligent he was, and how supremely intelligent and clever Jewish people were. And
He
Tenn
called them
said,
Homo superior.
yeah. And Tenn was like, do you really think I'm supposed to take that as a compliment? It's like,
Yeah, Philip Klass, aka William Penn, said
yeah.
about it that Campbell never understood his complaint. He kept thinking that he had misheard it as homo inferior and kept telling people, I said homo superior. He just didn't get it. He didn't get why that was a problem.
And I think we're seeing that kind of mutation of racial ideology today. I mean, increasingly, um, maybe not so much the alt-right, but their fellow travelers are imagining a superior race that now includes people from Asia and Jews and others. But it's the same playbook of imagining that there is a Homo superior and everyone else is inferior or even subhuman.
Vox Day is very overt about that, uh,
Oh
especially with
yeah,
regard
he's
to
a piece of
Asians. I
work.
mean, well, yeah, he's a
But uh, yeah, it's always. I mean, on the one hand, I think we are all, at least most of us here, are old enough to remember when you get beat up for being a nerd, and I think that imagining fans as slans or whatever kind of thing was, a reaction like circling the wagons and saying metaphorically and saying we're actually better than our bullies. We will win in the end. That is an understandable human reaction to any kind of bullying, and it's interesting to reading your text about when that slides into racist prefigured racist thought and when that doesn't. And is it even possible to imagine, that, well, we're actually better than them in any way that isn't racist and eugenicist in some sense?
I mean, I don't think the superiority is recoverable, but I mean, we do see, we see on one hand, there's the narrative of the mutant as the superior being who needs to dominate the world. And then the other hand, there's X-Men, for example, where that experience of marginalization, the feeling of being bullied and put upon is parlayed into, oh, I cannot now maybe not fully identify, but at least empathize with and act in solidarity with other people who are marginalized and bullied for other reasons, their identity or other kinds of social ostracism. I think that is the way out of that is to recognize that you're not the only person who has that feeling of I have something to offer the world, but it's being denied. I think that's true of everyone at the moment, and so that I think is the way past that unearned sense of being the successor to humankind and everybody else being cattle.
Yeah, and I will add that, the white supremacists want to deal with that feeling by trying to put walls around everyone else and prevent them from participating in society,
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
right?
it just occurred to me that if you step outside of science fiction and look at some of a handful of the persistent literary motifs that we have in our popular mythologies, there's the constant story of the lone hero who comes to town, sees there's a problem, acts to fix the problem, and then leaves again. And of course, you can make a couple of assumptions that as soon as he's gone, the problem is going to reemerge because the people he was helping are too stupid to keep it solved. Uh, but, where the actual action of that is that the guy who is willing to take actions that are socially unacceptable in order to preserve a community simply cannot live in that community. So he has to leave, which is in itself a tragedy. And if you read it that way, it's kind of Shakespearean. But that idea feeds into, as I said earlier, a pathology where everybody wants to be that lone gunman and everybody has to be kept apart and isolated in order for us all to act in our own sphere as a lone gunman. And science fiction seems to offer a chance for that kind of thing to happen
Mhm.
on several levels. There's
Yeah,
this,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I mean, I think that there is this idea that we see in tech culture and to some extent in science fiction culture of that great ideas come from people who are to some extent like antisocial, that they have this sort of like um, I don't know, that they're not agreeable with others, that
Like John Galt.
yeah, yeah, they are, and that allows them to rise above the masses and come up with great ideas. When I guess we could, um, and we see this in some science fiction, propose an alternative way of thinking about innovation, which is often about collaboration, working with others, working in a lab, and being part of a larger community.
There's
Well,
also a in literature and many fields of art in general, there's a myth about creators that says creators can't help, they're so focused on their art that they can't help being terrible to the people around them, bad to their wives, so on and so forth. Always be alcoholics, whatever you want. That's kind of a myth that follows creative people, whether they're tech people or artists or whatever, all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very convenient for exploitative employers. If
Yeah.
people think that uh, being good at your job, or being creative, I guess I should say, entails not having a good home life and spending 20 hours at the office and
Mhm.
taking a lot of stimulants, and then that's often, I think, probably what their managers and the owners of the company want.
Mm.
There's a striking early Philip K. Dick story called The Golden Man, which posits the future of mutants who are, in a sense, superior to, they're a sort of Homo superior because they've mutated in a way that they can do many things better than what we call ordinary humans, but they are not more intelligent. They are less, they're totally different, less intelligent, just more ecologic, yeah, genetically superior, you might say, in the sense of surviving longer or having more children, whatever the criteria you might want to use. It's a strike, and it's clearly a criticism of the whole Homo superior concept, and I think it's one of the effective early treatments of that in a way to show light on what it's really like.
Well, and that kind of points up one of the things that I found interesting in this book is it gave a different perspective on the fact that we all of us have read lots and lots of science fiction novels which were clearly intended as warnings, and it's shocking to realize that there are some people that are reading them as prescriptive.
Yeah, you're reminding me of the Alex Blechman tweet from 2021. Sci-fi author, in my book, I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company, at long last, we have created the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi novel Don't Create the Torment Nexus. I mean, that sums up Tech Bros magnificently.
Yeah, yeah. Because they always think they're the ones that are going to be in charge of this
Yeah,
terrible
right. Well, they're the
technology.
leopards. They're
Yeah,
unleashing the leopards from
Yeah.
the leopard eating people's faces party. You know, I
It's
think
Jurassic
Ursula.
Park.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah,
It's Jurassic
exactly.
Park. Like,
That's
I'm going to
that's a
control
tech
the
bro dream,
dinosaurs here
Jurassic
now.
Park, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and yet at the end of the movie, the sweet old guy tech bro who invented it evades responsibility,
Hmm.
survives.
Hmm.
His employees are the ones who get killed, and the dinosaurs don't eat him, which is really kind of interesting.
That's different from the book, however.
That's fine. I mean, in the movie, um, the dinosaurs act
Well,
as a moral force, right? They only eat immoral people. Um, there are really no exceptions. There's
Hmm.
the closest is the gamesman who says clever girl. Like he's morally compromised, but everyone else, like the lawyer's only eaten when he decides to abandon the children, right? The Unix guy is eaten because he is in for money and not for safety. And they're like
yeah.
but they don't eat the guy who invented the island.
I mean, I
So
guess the next turn of the screw now, I think, is, they are inventing the torment nexus, and they tell everyone this is going to be so dangerous, and therefore you need to give us more money so that we can have the torment nexus center for ethics or something. Like it feels like we see
Yes.
with AI,
yeah,
like it's going to
Yeah, yeah.
destroy everything, and therefore please give us more money and power in order to
We have developed this terrible toxin that's going to decimate the planet. Give us more money so we can develop the antidote.
yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah. We're the responsible
Containment.
parties for that.
Yeah. Just give it.
So,
Otherwise, we can't hire QA engineers, and it's just going to go wrong.
so a question that follows science has followed science fiction for a few decades now, and I've been seeing online the discussion has taken on greater heat, and that is the fundamental question: is science fiction fundamentally progressive? Which it's a valid question. It would a facile answer is, well, it predicts these marvelous futures with all this wonderful technology and blah blah blah. It must be, but that's just a surface detail. So,
Yeah, I mean that's something I definitely went back and forth on, um and I feel like even as time has passed, everybody keeps shifting on this question because when I first started the project, I kind of came in guns blazing and was sort of like, here's the fascist aspect of science fiction, and a lot of science fiction scholars were upset about that. And then I backed off of, and then everybody else is like, oh, you're really underselling this fascist dimension of science fiction after, 2016 or 2017 rolled around, or maybe it's a little bit later than that. But yeah, I mean, I think the what I come down on is it's not that science fiction can be anything you want. I feel like that is kind of a facile answer that doesn't take into account that science fiction has a real history and a cultural context, and every science fiction novel is in some way in conversation with that, with the past. I think that we have to, as I suggest in the book, think of science fiction as a train of struggle that can be favorable or unfavorable to different kinds of politics. And so we shouldn't simply say that we can erase the etch a sketch of science fiction and just do whatever. We have to grapple with those moments in its past that it's reflected the larger culture, which is white supremacist, settler colonialist, patriarchal, and so on. Um, I don't know if that's a always an entirely satisfying answer, but I think that basically the definition of science fiction is something that is up for grabs, what its politics are. And at certain moments it's very clearly progressive. We talked about the Futurians, for example. Um, and at other moments, I think the right succeeds in capturing it for their own.
mm,
So we've had a few years since your book came out, just a couple,
Yeah.
but there's this surge of like Afrofuturism and like diversity in books in general. And I'm wondering if you had another opportunity to write the next chapter, what you would have to say about that. And like, we defeated sort of the sad puppies, but they're not gone. So like I just am curious what your thoughts are on like Afrofuturism and how especially the N.K. Jemisin being a particular target and now that's burgeoning. So I'm just curious your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely the case that Afrofuturism and indigenous futurism and a wide variety of new tendencies, African futurism within science fiction, have really taken off, and I feel like are definitely now the dominant. Um, at the same time, I think that science fiction is such a large field at this point. Like, in some ways, like I feel like we beat the puppies, but we beat them within the precincts of certain literary science fiction culture, the kind of people who go to Worldcon now. Um, and yet there's this larger field where we're seeing science fiction ideas, whether it be in the Trump administration or Elon Musk, or to some extent in other kinds of media. I don't know if we've won in those kinds of terrains, but I think you're right. Like, I don't think that we're at a moment where we could say that the sad puppies or the rabid puppies represent even a significant group of mainstream literary science fiction culture.
mm, yeah. Because I remember when
So
the sad puppies thing really exploded and everybody was trading arrows over the internet. One of the things that kept getting pointed out that the people who were bitching the most about being ignored in the awards were doing quite well financially. Their books
Yeah,
were selling like hotcakes. They just weren't getting Hugo nominations.
I think it's a good point. It is and I've noticed now around a lot of these kinds of controversies, whenever there's some debate about, I don't know, the racial background of somebody cast in a blockbuster science fiction film or whatever, there is a whole kind of group of, I'll just call them vultures, that clearly are making pretty good money and getting a lot of clicks by intervening in these debates. And we saw it probably perfected first by Breitbart.com, but now there's a whole ecosystem of these little projects that are clearly rely on keeping this culture war alive. And yeah, they can't, they've got lots of money. They can't be satisfied with that. They want prestige. It's weird. So many of the puppies and others like them they're, unabashedly kind of sort of like this is supposed to be fun and it's all about guns and fighting monsters or whatever. But we also want literary prestige. I think they don't quite get that the way things work is that market success does not immediately parlay itself into critical success.
Mm, yeah. Oh well.
Well, I
But
mean,
the
it's
question
interesting
about
that the Dragon Awards came out of all of that, right? Like the science fiction community essentially said, well, if you want awards, make your own damn awards. And so they did. And I kind of see that as a positive thing, especially, because like some of the nominees for Dragon Awards are things like, Kim Stanley Robinson was nominated for a Dragon
Yeah,
Award,
that's that.
I
I
mean,
saw that, and it's sort of like the Prometheus Award, which was,
Mhm.
quite ostensibly established as a libertarian award, and yet as time progressed, literary quality clearly began to matter more
right?
than than the libertarian quest. So I'll be interested to see if in 10 years the Dragon Awards are going to people who are also winning, getting on Nebula ballots and Hugo ballots as well.
There is
Because
some, oh, there's to
There's
me a
definitely overlap.
surprising amount of overlap. I mean, not
And
a ton, but it's there, you know?
yeah, because at
And
the end of the day, you have to know how to write and tell a good
well,
story.
yeah,
remember too that one of the sad puppies' most hated figures was John Scalzi. John
Mm.
Scalzi does not write highfalutin literary fiction.
Nope.
He writes often rather pulpy, definitely adventurous, fun-oriented, and financially successful novels. Uh,
and with a lot
so,
of white male protagonists, I might
well,
add,
green, green male
but
protagonist.
but I don't think the problem would be with Scalzi's actual published works. I think it's probably a problem with his blog because he has things to
Yeah,
say and he's not
Yeah.
shy about saying
Well, that may
Yeah.
well be the case, but their ostensible claims were not about the views of the authors, but about the kind of fun. I mean, that's the argument they're making. Science fiction used to be
Good
fun. There
old
used to be,
fashioned,
yeah,
right.
rockets and
It was a
robots.
straw man argument, but it was their argument. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like Gamergate was all about ethics and journalism, right?
Yeah. Well,
Nothing to
when
do
Anne
with,
Leckie swept all the awards and people were
yeah,
complaining bitterly about how, radical her fiction was, and when you actually broke it down, she wrote a fairly straightforward interstellar adventure with
And
some very solid, almost traditional background ideas, and she only changed one thing that drove them all nuts, which was the gender pronoun.
Mhm.
Otherwise, she gave them exactly what they were claiming that they wanted.
yeah.
And I should say, like, I would want to reclaim pulp. I think that their depiction of pulp is often really homogenous and reductive. There's always been market-oriented fiction that
sure.
is by women, that is queer, that is not what they would want. And there were vast industries churning out subversive pulp in especially by the 50s and 60s. So
Well,
the idea
C.L.
that
Moore and
yeah, that's what. Yeah, CL Moore definitely. Yeah, yeah,
Lee
yeah,
Brackett,
yeah. And so they even that I think that they're really selective. I think that there was no time where it was all just yeah, good old fashioned fun. It was always it never fit their vision of the past.
Well, one
Yeah.
of the things about science fiction and about pulps in general, which certainly goes into romances and obviously into certain paperback genres like a lot of the porn genres,
Hmm.
um, is that since they were kind of low prestige avenues, low prestige channels for publishing, they could sort of almost invisibly publish books by lesbians, books by blacks, books by uh, people with books by blacklisted writers or people with political differences. It may not have got noticed in the wider world that much, but it was there in the underground fiction, pulp fiction, whatever you want to call it, spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When Ancillary Justice came out, I remember being at a convention and being in a discussion group with a particularly exercised young fan who just thought that it was the worst thing ever. And I just started tasking him, well, what is it about that you don't like? And after 20 minutes of just peeling back the layers, finally he admitted that he hated the gender shift. And I said, oh, I get it now. You just don't know who to be in charge of. I was less delicate about what I said to him, but you just don't know automatically who's supposed to be subservient. And I think that an awful lot of the complaints from these people are based in things that they just don't, either they don't realize that's where it's coming from, or they know they can't actually say that out loud.
And in
Well,
some ways,
it could go back to the way that I've now decided to read things. I read it from a female viewpoint. Until proven
Yeah,
otherwise, it's a
right,
female writing it, right?
right.
So I think these people, when they start reading a book, they're reading it, it's a dominant white male is the
Yep,
main character. And whenever it slaps them in the face that it's not only not a dominant white male character, but they don't know what
right,
it is.
right.
They don't know what to do with it.
Yeah,
But now, in the
and
case of the ancillary justice books, even for me to some extent, and I think for a lot of readers, they were reading all the characters as female because that's what the pronoun was, and it's absolutely not what Anne meant.
yeah,
And she's said many times that she knows which of her main characters, uh, are biologically male and which are biologically female, and some aren't either, maybe. But she knows that, but she doesn't tell you. You can pick up on clues. Maybe some of the clues you'll be wrong about because you're making assumptions and so
yeah,
on. That's a part of the whole point of it. But it's confusing for some people just to
yeah.
say
I think it's
that.
safe to say that this group here would read that and we would have a moment of disorientation and then go, ah, I see what's going on, and then enjoy it for what's being presented. But there are going to be some people who will be eternally frustrated by that through the whole thing. It's not pleasurable for them.
I mean, in some ways, I think that's a betrayal of, I mean, maybe this is going back on what I said before, a betrayal of like what I think of as the best of science fiction culture, where they can imagine a world with sentient spaceships and interstellar travel, but they can't imagine a world that doesn't have the same gender hierarchy as the one that they grew up in. So I think that
Yeah,
it's important to go even further than just imagining new gadgets, but rather imagine the possible societies and the possible ways of being that might be in the future that don't always line up with our experiences.
yeah,
I think we had a sort of reckoning about that when we read some older texts. And the science seems radical and the social structures were shifting, but women were mostly prostitutes and they liked it. And that was the most creative these guys could get in the 70s. And Lisa and I were like, moving on. You're supposed to be creative.
Yeah.
This is science fiction.
Well, and I wanted to ask a question along those lines because we do read, I mean, our whole thing is we read classic science fiction and we read modern science fiction. And I understand that if you really want to appreciate the genre, um, being well versed in classic science fiction and where it all came from and where it's going is important. But I think so many times we read those older classic texts and we say, well, remember that it's a product of its era, or we're way too forgiving. And I'm wondering, Jordan, what advice or what kind of thing would help to get my brain in the right mindset to read those texts in a productive way and not because now I'm just going to feel creepy reading stuff like that after reading your book. So how should I reframe when I read classic text like that?
So Jordan ruined classic science fiction for
Oh
you. Well
no.
done.
Got so dirty.
Well, there's still Samuel Delaney. But I think that
Who loves Star Wars, by the way.
yeah, I have to admit, but maybe I'll use that as an example. Like it's difficult because like I love Star Wars. Like I can see the political problems with Star Wars, but it's
So
part
do I.
of my childhood, and it's part of, like I immediately when I hear the Star Wars soundtrack, like, something stirs in my soul. I can't, it's hard. And well, where I grew up reading in like elementary school for some reason, H.P. Lovecraft, who obviously is a horrendous person, and whose fiction is really problematic. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like I think that I don't know if there's one way to sort of like read some of that material, or from the past with retrograde ideas and be entirely okay with it. I guess maybe the way to do that might be to read some of these things against the grain. Some of the moment I would look for moments where their kind of um, static and backwards view of the future begins to slip a bit, and see maybe if there are moments where, in spite of themselves, they're presenting something new and more interesting. But also, I mean, we've seen in past generations, um, I mean, and Delaney is a great example, reading Heinlein. So many readers, or, we could go back to people who shipped Spock and Kirk. So many people have like read uh, all these old texts in ways that maybe the creator would not have intended, but could be more interesting and more current and relevant and politically not as mired in the old hierarchies.
So
One
right
thing,
now,
So when you're doing, I'm just gonna, something occurred to me hearing this advice, which is that a lot of your book, you talk about how the white nationalists creatively misread texts for their purposes. And this sounds like you're suggesting we do the same for the purposes of diversity and equality.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the white nationalists ripped off people in the humanities who do this sort of go back and look at the great canonical authors and then discover the subversive dimension to them. Um, Not to suggest that being a great canonical author is synonymous with bad politics, but you know what I mean? Like, to go back into the past and find moments, because there's no, there's always going to be a moment where, even if they're um, trying to contain these alternate possibilities, there's no way that they can write a great text without in some way engaging with these questions, and maybe accidentally saying something more interesting than they intended.
so right now I'm reading Naomi Kanakia's new book, What Makes the Great Book So Great. And she makes a whole bunch of points that are positives, primarily dealing with great works. And you said something there, a great work must deal with the ambiguous questions, even if it's coming from a social milieu that's different from ours. If the work is great enough, it's probably challenging these questions, even if it comes to a conclusion we disagree with. But she makes another point that I think is important that we kind of forget a lot nowadays, I think. She says the great books have the most important diversity, and that's diversity of time. The viewpoints of people in 30 BC, in 1250 AD, in the 19th century, are radically different from our viewpoints today in many ways. And some of them are ways in which we strongly disagree with and should disagree with, in my personal opinion. But it still shows us something. We can still learn something, especially from a great writer. And also, there's something Adam Troy Castro says a lot. He says, whenever he might use the term canceling, but whenever you're disapproving of something that somebody in the 1900s thought or said. Just remember, 100 years from now, there will be somebody very strongly disapproving of something you are thinking and saying right now. And just at least, it's not like, oh, we should totally forgive those old thoughts. It's we should have bigness of mind to see where it came from and read it in context, yet read it with our own viewpoint. But and like I said, I have this romantic view, which is probably over romantic, that a great writer, even when a bad person, when they write, sometimes it's like they can't help telling the truth, even if their beliefs are different to that.
One of the problems we have with science fiction as it ages is the same problem you have with mystery novels. Look at the original title of And Then There Were None.
Yeah.
If you don't know the original title, look it up.
Even look at this second title.
Popular fiction by nature mirrors the culture it comes out of, and therefore lots of popular fiction will contain the prejudices of the time. Mm-hmm. So if you want to read popular fiction from the 1930s, and this includes Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, you're going to see some attitudes we don't hold anymore. And as a reader, what you have to decide is, am I getting other benefits that I enjoy as a reader? Because right now, we are all old enough that unless we are teachers, there's no reason to read anything we're not enjoying, unless someone gives us a paid writing assignment or a duty that we've accepted, like we're editing an anthology or something. Therefore, if you run into stereotypes you don't like and the way the writer handled it, and it bothers the shit out of you, just stop reading it. And if it's part of the group, said I got to page 40 and there were just too many crazy prostitutes for me to like this novel.
Yeah.
But
I have a problem with that. I do that all the time.
And then, but the other part is if you can find a way to read contextually, like if you know in science fiction in the 1970s, there's a lot of things that were thought were supposed to look like free love, but they don't look like that anymore. And you just got that there were, Randy, you get this a lot in John Varley, all these people who shouldn't fuck each other, because in the 1970s, people fucking each other in a magazine of fantasy and science fiction, even though it's written discreetly, is like the whole sexual revolution appearing, especially if you read it when you're 16. But I think for the older audiences too, because people didn't complain about these things in the 70s, maybe Joanna Russ. So I do think you want to apply context when you can't say, yeah, that sounds like the 40s. There are some people who go overboard, and then you go, that's a little more than the 1940s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with everything you said there, and I will add that science fiction has an added problem in that I can read Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler or anybody who's writing about the time in which they lived, and even with all of the little caveats you mentioned, I'm fine with it because they were writing about their day. But science fiction is supposed to be about another time and about the future. So it is a failure of imagination when what they're doing is replicating the present day, which, that's just one of the difficulties of writing it. But that's why it comes in for extra scrutiny and extra, a little extra sensitivity, because it's not supposed to keep being that way.
But
yeah, I think it's also important though to see that and call it out. I think it's okay to read those books and be like, well, I mean, there were some cool ideas there, but this was a big problem, and and society's changing, but it's not completely changed. And I think there's really value in analyzing what goes wrong and labeling it and just being like, okay, well, let's keep fighting that fight. Let's keep moving on in the direction we want to be moving in.
to go
And
to an
my
actual great book, Anna Karenina, uh, you know, you probably know the story, but it has essentially two threads, and one is about an ultimately successful marriage in which the woman, in essence, accepts and really enjoys a rather traditional position for her society uh, as a wife and mother. And the other is about a woman who commits adultery to escape a really horrible marriage and is shunned by society. And my personal opinion, some people seem to disagree with me, but I don't get where they come from, realizes that her new lover is actually a horrible sexist person also. But and she ends up committing suicide. Uh, some people say, well, Tolstoy was lecturing us that that's what happens if you commit adultery. And maybe Tolstoy meant that, maybe not. But I think in the context of the book, what I see is a true tragedy of a brilliant woman whose society did not allow her to live a life that she ought to have been able to live. And Tolstoy shows that, whether he meant to or not.
No, it's in the text.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you look at the essays in War and Peace. The essays are dumber than the narrative.
Yeah.
Anna Karenina starts with the husband fucking around, and everything is about you need to stop to preserve your marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So he stops and everything is settled. Anna Karenina is never given that option.
Right.
And Tolstoy clearly sets that up, that she's not given the same option. Second, after she commits suicide, what all of society says about her and all the conclusions they draw are completely wrong. None of them match what we know happened. So it's very much about how the society operates and very much the hypocrisy of it. Edna O'Brien, who is a strong woman writer, loves the novel, and she basically feels that it works because Tolstoy was Anna Karenina. And he basically wrote himself as a woman, and that's what makes the novel work.
There's a really great passage in there too about Dolly, that part of the third couple, if you will, when Dolly fantasizes about leaving her husband and about what she could be, and she ends up, of course, deciding not to do that. But it's a tremendously feminist passage. It's certainly in the context of 1870s Russia, and
okay, we're drifting a little bit,
as we are wont to do.
As we are wont to do. But
I have a question actually that I think does relate. Jordan, we were talking earlier about just before the Russian literature segue. We were talking, this group is known for bringing in everything, the kitchen sink, and bringing in a discussion. We were talking about like the double, and this is my summary, the sort of the double burden on science fiction. The difficulty in science fiction is that, you know, you're not, as Mark said, just writing about your contemporary time. You're often writing about the future. And I'm wondering how much the tech bros and the white supremacists, and here I'm conflating them, but I'm sure there are tech bros who are not white supremacists, how they are looking at that science fiction, you know, that might have, say, 1950s cultural norms in the future because it was written in the 1950s or whatever. They're looking at that and going, oh, well, it's about the future. So clearly that is aspirational and also, you know, denotes what we should be doing, right? And what it's likely to be. And that therefore it's depicting a superior society. And that superior society just happens to look like 1950s middle-class America. But it's in the future and it's by a canonical science fiction writer. So it must be what we should strive for, right? It's prescriptive. And that's how I'm reading it.
That was one of the things that I late in the book wanted to get at, late in the writing of the book, I think it's pretty early in the book where I talk about that, is that that the right, including the tech right and the white supremacist right, um, do don't seem to realize that the relationship between science fiction and the present is complicated.
Mhm.
It could be, as we've kind of talked about, a diagnosis or an allegory for the present. It could be a thought experiment. It could be a utopia. It could be a prediction. And I feel like they kind of flatten a lot of things too, view science fiction, and in particular, yeah, those kind of retro-futurist visions of science fiction, um, as purely prescriptive. And I think that maybe that we as readers should um, recognize that it's probably multiple things at once. Like we need to be able to read science fiction as an expression of possibilities, but also as mechanism for critiquing the present and as a kind of diagnostic tool. I mean, I think that's why one should read right-wing science fiction often is that or right-wing fiction in general is that the really great right-wing authors accidentally kind of give us a glimpse into how their inner workings through their work. I mean, the example I think would be H.P. Lovecraft, as I mentioned earlier. Um, so yeah, I think we have to um, avoid seeing science fiction as here is the next stage of history that we then have to follow.
Didn't somebody say that there's a period in which any science fiction story is really set, and it's usually like 10 years before the story was published. And sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's kind of unconscious. But I think, like you said, many science fiction novels, in depicting a future, whether utopian, dystopian, or just different, are actually using that as a way of criticizing the present.
Mhm, 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 mhm.
So
Okay, I'm urged by Cliff to mention what I put in the chat. That sort of reflects my pet theory that basically science fiction is epistemological fiction, which is one of the things that makes it both exciting and dull. Because it's philosophy. And Asimov pointed this up, I think, because his approach to it was Socratic. It's all dialogue. It's question and answer. It's assertion and challenge. And a good deal of the better science fiction partakes of that particular format. Um, and hence, all of it ought to be read as a challenge to assumptions. Whether you end up agreeing with them or not, you should, after reading a good science fiction story, be thinking about all of the assertions that are made in the story and come to your own conclusions. But it's not there to salve your conscience or mollify you in any way. It's there to challenge and overturn.
Yeah,
But
I think it's right. And I recently came out with a piece in Utopian Studies that there's a section where I talk about, and it's about utopias, but it could easily apply to science fiction too. The ways that, as Frederick Jameson points out, so many utopias are in dialogue. They're speaking back and forth, and the goal is not necessarily to say like I'm going to pick William Morris or Edward Bellamy. It's to look at the different possibilities that are being proposed and the different assumptions that are being challenged. Whereas in right-wing utopias, I don't think we're supposed to feel like that we have an option in, say, Atlas Shrugged to resist that idea. It's very much like this is how things should be. So yeah, I think seeing science fiction not as always a statement, but as a provocation to get us to think further, I think that seems like a good idea.
Okay. Before we burn the midnight oil, anybody have any last comments or questions?
Yeah, actually, if I could ask another one. I In your book, one of the things you touch on but don't focus on because it's not part of the main thrust of your book is a set of statements about capitalism that reflect what appears to be an underlying set of assumptions about capitalism. And if I may quote a couple of sentences, but capitalism's inner contradictions are the real cause of the current stagnation. As the rate of profit declines, private firms no longer invest at high levels in technologies that might dramatically increase productivity, growth, and improve everyday life. So, so you have a critique of capitalism in the book, and I'm wondering if for you, how important that critique of capitalism is to your critique of speculative whiteness, right? In other words, if, say, your theory of capitalism were ultimately proven incorrect, would that undercut your theory about speculative whiteness, or is it just another part of the sort of the Weltanschauung that you're working from?
I think that I could see, a lot of what I'm talking about in Speculative Whiteness, the book, is a discourse, an ideology, a set of myths and ideas. I think you could talk about that without the larger explanatory framework that I give. But at least for me, I think it's important to think about, like, where did this come from and why did it seem to become so prominent in recent years? And I think if we look at the statements of um, some of the people on the tech right, there's a sense that they should be making more profits. The innovation should be happening faster. We need flying cars right now or yesterday, and everything should be different. And so I think that there's a sense that, however you want to explain it in Marxist terms or otherwise, something hasn't gone right in capitalism, and they think that it's either because of democracy or it's because the genetically superior people aren't in control. So I think that obviously those ideas are often around, but I think those have become more salient in the culture at a moment when it feels like there's a crisis and nobody has a solution. That the fascists emerge in moments when um, the political economy and the society at large feels stuck and is looking for some way out.
Hmm.
Thank you. And I should add that I don't disagree with your
Okay.
assessment. I was just curious about that. Although I will also add that I really want my flying car now, please. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Good luck affording the insurance. Uh,
Yeah, well,
so, anybody else?
I guess just the last thing I would ask is like, how did you actually get through writing this book? Because it seems like obviously you're not a fascist, but you must have had some sort of fascination, I'm guessing, or like what drove that, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, I think part of it let me think. I mean, part of it was like, who else is gonna do it? I think a lot of it was sort of like, I have this position of relative privilege. I I mean, my first book was about obscenity, so I've spent a lot of time reading what are often difficult texts. Um, and so part of the thought was like, there's this whole archive of stuff that people aren't looking at because it's so unpleasant. And so maybe I should be the one to do that. But I'll say that by the end, and part of the reason why I'm not like publishing a million follow-ups, I got like, it was difficult. Like, I just like, I felt it was not a good feeling to be at the end of this project. And so I kind of was like, all right, I'm done for a while, or at least I'm going to hold this at a distance. Um, yeah, I don't know if there's a fascination with fascism, but there were moments where, listening to the podcasts and stuff, where they did sound like regular science fiction fans. And so that was another thing, is this sort of listening to Richard Spencer talk about a coffee table book with the Hodorowski's Dune, and it was like, oh, if you didn't hear what was around it, you would think that this was just a couple of science fiction fans or grad students talking. So I guess maybe that was the morbid curiosity, is how could somebody who, like I said earlier, is kind of in my milieu in some way, come to such horrible conclusions. And maybe, yeah, part of it was to say then that, am I implicated in that, and what do I need to do to unearth that?
I have to say it's incredibly dedicated and prolific research. I think we kind of mentioned before you called in that we're reading through it and like, oh, there's a long way to go, and then come to like 10 pages of footnotes. Like, oh, and now I'm 10 pages further on, and I don't read that much purely academic stuff, and this is obviously an academic text in addition to something accessible to anyone interested in it. But um, I was really impressed with how much research is just reflected by the amount of footnotes. And also, I find a hard time devoting time to listening to normal podcasts. The notion of listening to a bunch of fascists talking for an hour or more
Yeah.
is horrifying, frankly.
No, and it's worse in some ways than reading because it sneaks up on you where,
Yeah.
you could stop reading, whereas if you have the podcast in, it's just they're going to keep talking. No, I mean a lot of those footnotes I used to be writing, like used to be, I wrote a lot about things that didn't get into the book too. So I'm glad that people see and appreciate the footnotes.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I went down rabbit holes. I was reading the electronic edition, and I could click the links, and then so it took me longer to read the book than it might otherwise have done.
My Kindle doesn't take me to the links, unfortunately.
That's reading on an iPhone. I will say Philip K. Dick expressed something similar after he tried and abandoned the idea of writing a sequel to Man in the High Castle, and he wrote an essay about it, saying that he just couldn't stand being in their heads anymore.
Yeah, that's the worst part is, I mean, there were plenty of bad parts, but the moment when I saw a science fiction text and imagined what Richard Spencer would say about it and produced an entire reading, and I was like, no, this is bad. Like, this is not where I want to be.
That'll ruin the book for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, on behalf of the group, I'd like to say thank you again. This has been really, really tasty in many ways, very informative, depressing, and and illuminating it in equal measure. Um, I I appreciate your time, and I really appreciate your work. Thank you for having done that. Now I don't have to do it.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Thank you for reading all of that and breaking it down so I don't have to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Thank you
exactly.
for listening to those podcasts, so we never have to.
yeah, you're not missing anything. Don't do it. Yeah, no, thank you all. I really appreciated this.
No, thank you.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.